These events occurred over 20 years ago, back before things like smartphones existed, so keep that in mind. My best friend from university and I had just got back after completing 2 grueling back-to-back tours. We decided to get together for the weekend, so he drove down to my place. That Friday evening we went out for steaks, then afterwards I suggested we stop by a pier close to my home for a smoke. I had brought back some Cuban cigars. He drove us there in his pickup truck, and there was a group of teenagers partying when I got there. We parked on the other side of the pier, then we lit up while listening to some Zeppelin on the radio. The pier was part of a small park beside the river, and it was located at the end of a road in an elite residential area. Some time passed, and then a motorized cart pulled up to the pier. Immediately, a couple of park rangers got out and walked over to confront the teenagers. Johnny turned down the volume so we could listen better. One of the rangers was a short, scrawny young man, and the other was a young woman. Immediately, the male ranger started to harass the kids, asking them if they were smoking weed. I could tell they felt uncomfortable and didn't say much in return. The male ranger then told them he'd have to confiscate the drugs. The teenagers broke into a run, quickly scampering away, while the rangers just stood there and watched them. Next, the rangers headed towards the truck where we were. "Good evening," said the male ranger. "I'm going to need you to step out of the truck," he said. "Why's that?" asked Johnny, sounding agitated. "This area has a bad reputation for drug use," replied the ranger. "We don't use drugs," Johnny said as he opened his door. Simultaneously, I got out on my side and we towered over both of them. "We don't want any problems," I added. The male ranger was quiet for a moment, then replied, "I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." He told Johnny, but he crossed his arms against his chest and stared back. The female ranger then made a sudden movement, and Johnny reacted immediately, cold cocking her. She crumpled like a rag doll and fell limp to the ground. "Oh gosh," said the male ranger. "Now you've gone and done it." He began to reach for the walkie-talkie hanging on his belt. Johnny quickly grabbed the radio and threw it in the bed of his truck. "That was a dumb move. She'll be all right," Johnny said. A cool breeze started to blow while the clouds began to clear, revealing a full moon. "Can you swim?" I asked the ranger. "What?" he asked with a cracking voice. I grabbed him by both wrists, lifting his arms up over his head. Johnny squatted and grabbed his ankles, then we lifted him off the ground and began to carry him towards the pier. "Let me go right now," cried the ranger. "Shut up, tough guy," Johnny told him as we stepped onto the pier. You could hear the planks crack as we carried him to the far end. The sound of the waves splashing against the pylons was soothing. We began to swing the ranger back and forth. Together we tossed him off the end into the river. There was a splash as the ranger hit the water. His head broke the surface when he bobbed back up. You could tell he was already shivering in the cold water. "Keep an eye on him," Johnny said as he walked away. A few moments later, I could hear the whiny engine of the ranger's cart turning over, then it came to life. Johnny drove the cart onto the pier, turned off the engine, and got back out. Next, he rolled it off the side, and it made a big splash when it hit the water, then sank like a rock. We could hear the ranger whimpering below, while the water splashed against his face. Johnny looked down at him and frowned. "Learned your lesson, tough guy?" The ranger was treading water and didn't reply. Johnny and I both took one more long look at him, then walked back off the pier. As we approached the truck, we saw the other ranger sprawled in grass, out cold. We got in the truck, relit our cigars, then drove off. "There's a nice tavern not far from here I've been telling you about," I said to Johnny. "Let's go," he replied. Then we both laughed, enjoying the coolness of the slight breeze blowing through the cabin of the truck. "They got off easy," Johnny said while he turned up the volume of the radio. A song by Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry was playing. I replied, and we both smiled, driving away back into the dark night. This happened back in 2012 when I was 31 years old. I had been married for 2 years at the time, but me and my wife didn't have kids yet. We did have a dog, though. Her name is Megatron, and she's a Rottweiler mix. Although she looked kind of intimidating, she is really sweet and would never hurt anyone. I had a full-time job, but it wasn't quite enough because my wife wasn't working. Because of that, I was picking up some extra money by doing Uber in the evenings. This happened on a Tuesday night in the fall at around midnight. I had just gotten off from work, and when I got home, I decided to take Megatron for a walk. The park was quiet, as it usually was at that hour. The gravel path we took was lined with tall lampposts. To one side of the path was an open grassy field, and to the other was a dense wooded area. It wasn't the kind of place I liked lingering in, but the isolation was calming in its own way. As we walked, Megatron suddenly pulled hard on her leash, veering off the path toward the woods. She did this every now and then, usually when she caught the scent of something interesting. I would let her lead for a bit, knowing she'd lose interest soon enough, but this time was different. She wasn't just curious, she was determined. Her muscles strained as she tugged me forward, and it was all I could do to stay on my feet. All right, I'm coming," I muttered, stepping off the path. The gravel gave way to soft dirt and underbrush, and the light from the lamps barely reached us. I followed her into the shadows, using my phone's flashlight to avoid tripping. After a few minutes, Megatron stopped abruptly, sniffing at something under a bush. That's when I saw it. It was a backpack. It was old and scuffed up, with one of the straps hanging by a thread. It was partially hidden, like someone had tossed it there in a hurry. At first I thought someone might have left it behind by accident, maybe a long time ago, but the way it was tucked away felt intentional, and it didn't look very weathered. I crouched down to get a better look, then I unzipped the bag. Inside were stacks of cash, neatly bundled up like they'd just come from the bank. I stared at it for a moment, but it didn't hit me what was happening right away. People didn't just leave that kind of money lying around. The thought of who it might belong to, or what they might do to get it back, sent a chill down my spine. I quickly zipped the bag halfway shut and stood up, brushing dirt off my hands. I didn't want to be anywhere near it. "Come on, girl," I said, tugging on Megatron's leash. She hesitated, giving the bag one last sniff before following me back toward the path. Back on the lit trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Megatron walked beside me, but she looked back every few seconds. I don't know what it was about that bag. Maybe the drug dealer that it belonged to left his lunch in the other compartment. That would explain why she was so interested in it. In any case, I picked up the pace because I was eager to get out of there. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots, and I tried to focus on that sound, using it to drown out my thoughts. As we neared the park's entrance, I spotted someone walking toward us. He was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and his head was down. At first I thought he was just another guy going for a walk, but as he got closer, he looked up at me. His expression was hard to read, but something about it made me uneasy. We passed each other without a word, and I couldn't help but notice the way his head turned slightly as he walked away. It was like he was watching me. I didn't stop to look back. Instead, I sped up, gripping Megatron's leash tightly. She seemed to sense my tension and stayed close to my side. We were almost at the main road when I turned around and saw him again. He was running, not full speed, but fast enough to close the distance between us. I kept walking fast, resisting the urge to break into a run. If I started running, it might provoke him, and I didn't want to find out how that would end. Finally, we reached the main road. The bright streetlights and the occasional passing car gave me a sense of relief. I turned again, and this time he wasn't there. Maybe he had given up, or maybe he was waiting for another chance. Either way, I didn't plan to stick around to find out. When we got home, I locked the door behind us and double-checked the windows. Megatron sat by the door, with her ears still perked up. It was a scary encounter, but I didn't know for sure if the guy was after us. As for the cash, I decided not to call the cops because it was really none of my business. Where I come from, you don't get the police involved for things like that. You just mind your own business. The next night, however, I was asleep in bed when my wife shook me awake. "There's someone downstairs," she whispered, her voice trembling. I sat up and listened. Sure enough, I heard faint noises coming from the front of the house. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and motioned for Megatron to follow me. She was already on high alert. We crept down the stairs as quietly as we could, and the noise grew louder. It was a shuffling sound, like someone was trying to force the lock. When we reached the bottom, I flipped on the light, and Megatron barked so loudly that my ears were ringing. The man at the door froze. He was wearing a hoodie, and I recognized him instantly as the guy from the park. As soon as he saw me and Megatron, he took off down the road. Just like that, he was gone. We called the cops, but there wasn't much they could do. They took a report and said they'd keep an eye on the area, but I knew that was the end of it. I couldn't prove the guy had anything to do with the backpack, but it felt too coincidental. After that, we installed security cameras around the house. A few nights later, I checked the footage and saw a couple of men hanging around outside. They didn't try to break in, but they looked sketchy. Things eventually settled down, and no one tried to break in again. But every time I walked the dog at night, I couldn't help but feel like someone might be watching. I like to jog in the park after work, and I usually end my run by sitting on the same bench to cool down. The park was always a good spot to unwind, quiet with just a few regulars. One evening, as I stretched near my usual bench, I noticed a guy pacing nervously near the playground. He was wearing a hoodie pulled low over his face, and kept glancing around like he was looking for someone. It struck me as odd, but I figured it wasn't any of my business, so I finished my water and got ready to head back home. Over the next few minutes, I couldn't help but glance at him again. He kept pacing in the same spot, looking more jittery than before. Something about the way he moved made me uneasy. He was too fidgety, almost like he was working himself up to do something. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, because people have their own reasons for acting a little off, and it wasn't my job to figure them out. I stayed on the bench longer than I intended, just watching him out of the corner of my eye. Eventually, the guy stopped pacing and stood still for a moment, looking at the people walking by on the path. He shoved his hands into the pocket of his hoodie, and I thought about leaving. It wasn't like I could do anything even if he was up to no good. But just as I got up, he started walking quickly toward the parking lot. I figured he was leaving, so I shrugged it off and headed toward the park exit myself. It was starting to get dark, and I didn't want to hang around too long. As I turned toward the main path, I heard a shout, so I looked back. That's when I saw a man pointing and yelling at the guy in the hoodie, who was now running full speed toward the parking lot. In his hand, he had what looked like a woman's purse. The man who had been shouting started to run after him, but stumbled and fell. The thief was getting away fast, and I froze for a moment because I was unsure of what to do. Then, without really thinking about it, I started running after him, even though I wasn't sure what I was going to do if I caught up to him. I wasn't the type to get involved in confrontations, let alone chase someone through a park, but as my feet pounded against the pavement, all I could think about was stopping him before he disappeared. The path ahead of me curved slightly, and I saw him veer off into the grass which was heading toward a cluster of trees. He was fast, but I was gaining on him anyway. A few other people stopped and watched as I ran past, but no one else joined in. By the time I reached the trees, he had almost made it to the park's edge. I shouted at him to stop, but he didn't even look back. Instead, he picked up speed and darted towards the parking lot. I could feel the adrenaline pushing me forward as I tried to close the distance between us. Part of me wanted to turn back and let him go, but another part couldn't give up. Just as he reached the edge of the park, I made a desperate push to catch up to him, but I still didn't know what I would do when I got there. My only goal was to stop him before he disappeared. When I got to him, I reached out and tried to grab the back of his hoodie, but he twisted away at the last second. He turned sharply and shoved me hard, sending me sprawling to the ground. I landed on my side, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Then I looked up and he started to run again. But by then, a couple of other people had joined the chase. Two men who had seen what happened came running towards us, and one of them tackled the thief to the ground. I sat up, trying to catch my breath as the two men wrestled with him. One of them managed to grab the purse, while the other held the thief down. A few seconds later, the police arrived. Someone must have called them during the commotion. The officers quickly took control and cuffed the guy, then led him away. The woman whose purse had been stolen came over. She was visibly shaken, but relieved to have her stuff back. The police asked me a few questions, and I did my best to explain what had happened. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, and my voice felt shaky as I went over the whole thing. When I got home, I sat down and thought about it for a long time. I didn't feel like a hero or anything like that, even though I know that I am one. I just felt relieved that no one had been seriously hurt, and that the thief had been caught. This happened a few years ago when I had a small apartment in the city. I was working long hours and had started running in the mornings to clear my head before going to the office. I liked to switch up my routes to keep things interesting, but one of my favorites was through a park just a few blocks from my building. It was quiet in the mornings, but it would be really busy whenever I went there on the weekends. Most weekday mornings, though, I shared the park with a few dog walkers or a cyclist, but it was never crowded. On my first run there, I noticed a man sitting alone on a bench near the main path. He looked to be at least 60, with gray hair and a tired expression. He was wearing a blue windbreaker and jeans, nothing fancy. At first I didn't pay much attention to him. Still, there was something about him, how he seemed almost rooted to that spot. It really made him stand out. But then I noticed he was there the next day too, sitting in the same place. In fact, he was there every time I passed, right in the same position with his hands on his knees. He didn't have a book or a phone, it was just him. After a couple of weeks, I started to feel curious, so one morning, I decided to say hello. I stopped near the bench to stretch, glancing at him a couple of times to see if he'd notice me. He didn't, but eventually I walked over and said, "Good morning." He looked up, blinking a couple of times as if I pulled him out of a deep thought. Then he nodded and said, "Morning." His voice was calm and soft, barely above a whisper. I asked if he came to the park often, and he said that he came every day. I nodded and smiled as if I already didn't know the answer. That was the start of our conversation. His name was Jim, and he didn't say much about himself, but he didn't seem annoyed that I was talking to him. I guessed he might be homeless. His clothes were clean but worn, and he had that look of someone who'd been through a lot. I didn't ask, though, and he didn't offer. We mostly talked about small things. I told him about my job, and he nodded politely, but didn't ask questions. After that, I made it a habit to stop and say hello when I ran by. Sometimes we'd chat for a minute or two, and other times it was just a quick nod and a smile. I didn't learn much about him beyond his first name, but he became a familiar part of my morning routine. There was something nice about seeing him there, because the park wasn't quite the same without him. I wondered sometimes what brought him to that bench each morning, but I never pressed him for answers. Then one day he wasn't there. I wasn't worried or anything because things can come up, but the next morning, the bench was empty again, and the morning after that. A week passed, then two, and I started to wonder what had happened. His absence felt strange, almost unsettling. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to worry. I didn't know anything about him beyond his name and a few casual conversations, so I didn't have any way to check on him. Still, I tried my luck at searching online for any news about someone matching his description. It felt silly at first, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I scoured local news sites and community forums, using vague search terms like man found or park incident. It became part of my routine, something I did in the evenings after work. Most of what I found was unrelated. There were stories about traffic accidents or events happening in other parts of the city, but I kept looking. It was frustrating not knowing where to start. Jim hadn't told me much about himself, and I hadn't thought to ask more personal questions. As the weeks went on, I started to feel a strange mix of hope and dread every time I opened a news site. Part of me wanted to find something, but another part of me was afraid of what I might discover. The uncertainty was exhausting, but I couldn't let it go. I felt like I owed it to him to keep looking. After a while, I came across an article that caught my attention. It was about a man found dead in an alley downtown. The article gave his name, which was Jim Barrett, and it mentioned that he was believed to have been homeless. There wasn't much detail, just that he'd been found by a passerby, and that authorities were still trying to determine the cause of death. I stared at the name for a long time before searching for more information. At the time, I didn't know if it was him or not, because he never told me his last name. But then I found a photo attached to another article, and it looked just like him. There was no mistaking it. It was Jim, the man I'd talked to almost every morning for weeks. I felt a wave of sadness and guilt. Now he was gone, and I'd never even asked him if he needed help, or if there was anything I could do for him. For a long time after that, I couldn't run in the park without thinking about him. The bench where he used to sit felt like a reminder of how fleeting those connections can be. I wished I'd done more, but I hadn't, and now it was too late.